The Amazing Life of Elizabeth Ware, née Cooper Wilson. Hi, in this video I'll be delving into the life and times of my earliest known Australian relative, my great-great-great-great-grandmother on my paternal side, Elizabeth Ware, née Cooper Wilson. If you haven't already done so, I recommend you watch day 5 of my road trip video series to gain a better understanding of where Elizabeth fits into the paternal side of my family tree. As you're about to learn, Elizabeth's story is a tragic account of a remarkable, courageous woman who strives to overcome seemingly insurmountable odds to be reunited with her family after being found guilty of a crime she didn't commit. The first record I have of Elizabeth indicates she was born in Kidderminster, Worcestershire, England in the year 1777. This is just 7 years after Captain Cook sailed into Botany Bay, Australia. The 18th century was a transformative period for Kidderminster, a town nestled in the heart of Worcestershire, England. It was rapidly evolving into a significant industrial centre, primarily driven by the burgeoning textile trade. It's unclear who Elizabeth's mother and father were and what they did for a living, but the fact that she uses a hyphenated surname, Cooper Wilson, when she marries some years later, suggests that her mother was Elizabeth Cooper, who was married to a Thomas Wilson in October 1779, 2 years after her birth. Hyphenated surnames were not common in 18th century England, so the fact that Elizabeth doesn't just adopt Thomas's surname Wilson when her mother marries suggests he was not her biological father, but her stepfather. Just 8 years later, in 1807, Thomas suddenly dies. He is recorded as a victualler from Wolverhampton, Staffordshire, England. Elizabeth is just 10 years old. Little is known of Elizabeth's early life until the 4th of December 1791, when her first child, born on the 19th of November, Charlotte Ware, is christened in Westminster, London. The father is recorded as a John Ware. Remarkably, both Elizabeth and John are the same age, 14 going on 15. 6 years later, Elizabeth and John welcome their second child, James, who is christened in Scarsborough, Yorkshire, on the 9th of April 1797. At this point, Elizabeth and John are both 20 years old and still not married, but all this changes 2 years later when on the 5th of August 1791 they finally marry at St Michael's La Belfray Anglican Church, Yorkshire, England. It is at the same church some 3 years later that Elizabeth and John's third child, Jane Ware, my great-great-great-great-grandmother, is christened on the 4th of April 1802, one day after her birth. Elizabeth's life in the 18th century Yorkshire must have been undeniably challenging. As a young mother raising 3 young children, she would have faced daily struggles with limited resources and rudimentary health care. Never in her wildest dreams could she have ever imagined how much more difficult life was to become when just 15 months later, on the 6th of July 1803, she finds herself standing before a Mr. Justice Rooke in the Old Bailey on 4 royal coining charges. The first charge reads that on the 6th of June 1803 she feloniously, knowingly, wittingly and without lawful excuse had in her possession and custody forged banknotes, that is to say, one of £2 and 4 banknotes for the payment of £1 each, she knowing them to be forged and counterfeited. The second charge, for that she on the same day had in her custody a certain other forged banknote for the payment of £1 she knowing it to be forged and counterfeited, and 2 other charges of her with having in her dwelling house the said forged banknotes, she knowing them to be forged. Remarkably, for reasons that only became clear several years later, and for which she no doubt regretted deeply, Elizabeth pleaded guilty to all charges and is sentenced to 14 years of transportation. But her ordeal doesn't end there. The very same day, she fronts a Mr. Justice Lawrence in the same court, where she faces 8 more royal coining charges. The first charge that on the 16th of May she forged a banknote for the payment of the sum of £1 with intent to defraud the governor and the company of the Bank of England. The second charge that she feloniously disposed of and putting away such note, knowing it to be forged, and 2 other charges for uttering and publishing as true a forged promissory note for the payment of £1, knowing it to be forged with the intent to defraud the governor and company of the Bank of England, and 4 other charges of intending to defraud a Mary Puller. Fortunately, no evidence was offered in support of these charges and Elizabeth was acquitted, but the damage had already been done. Later, we'll hear in her own words how Elizabeth naively took the blame for her husband, who had forged the notes, abandoning her and their children in the process as he fled the law. At the time of her sentencing, Jane, her youngest child, was only 1 year old, and as was often the case, accompanied her mother to Newgate Jail, London, where they both awaited transportation. The fate of her other 2 children, Charlotte and James, is unknown. It's here that Elizabeth, with the help of a party unknown, writes a series of heartfelt letters to the governors of the Bank of England, pleading for mercy for her and her children. The first letter is written from the sick ward of the prison and is dated the 20th of August, 1803. It reads, "Gentlemen, it is with the greatest humility I venture to obtrude my supplication, praying that your compassion may be extended towards me for the sake of my destitute and very distressed infants, trusting that their unhappy case will aid their captive mother by meeting those benevolent feelings which have often been the means of restoring the penitent offender to a grateful family. My sorrows, gentlemen, under the dilemma are great, and I really deplore the fatal error I have fallen into. Fatal indeed to me, having deprived me of my every comfort of domestic life, and left me with 3 helpless children, the eldest not being above 5 years, and an increase in expectancy, entirely friendless and fatherless, having neither heard nor received the least assistance from my husband since my confinement, and who will be truly orphans, unless, gentlemen, your condescension and humanity should alleviate my condition by interceding for some mitigation of my dreadful sentence, to be transported for the long and dreary space of 14 years. Be assured, gentlemen, that I shall ever most gratefully feel and acknowledge your great goodness, and look upon you as the instrument of mercy of Almighty God in raising me from the lowest depths of sorrow and misery to joy, comfort, and happiness, and ever most ardently pray that you may receive the due reward of compassion to the penitent and distressed. I most humbly beg leave to subscribe myself, gentlemen, your dutiful and devoted servant, Elizabeth Ware." On the other side of this letter, she writes, "I beg pardon, gentlemen, for further intruding to mention that the threatening expression said to have been uttered by me towards my husband must, with great reverence and humility I signify it, have arose through a misunderstanding, as it was ever my advice for him to speak the truth when questioned on the greatest of all consideration, that of his family. This the first of 3 letters received by the Bank of England from Elizabeth. After receiving no reply to her plea, Elizabeth writes the bank again about a month later on the 20th of September 1803, once more pleading for financial assistance. It reads,
Gentlemen, I very humbly beg pardon for the liberty I take in again obtruding on your notice, but the distress of myself and children, and the remorse and anxiety I daily experience on account of my sad situation will, I trust, be considered as some apology for doing so. I only beg, gentlemen, in this to be permitted to draw your recollection and imitation that some pecuniary aid would, on sending, be charitably bestowed on me, and while I should acknowledge any, the smallest donation, with the deepest impressions of gratitude, my feelings would likewise teach me ever to pray that the divine protection may attend on those who might be instrumental under Providence to soften my affliction, by interposing for some mitigation of my unhappy doom, before a draft of female convicts should be sent from hence, which I am led to believe will shortly take place. I most humbly rest, gentlemen, with the greatest deference, your devoted servant, ElizabethWare.
Remarkably, the governors of the bank appear to heed Elizabeth's request for financial help, and on the 28th of September 1803, Elizabeth sends another letter thanking them. It reads,
Sir, having received your charitable donation, I catch the first opportunity very humbly to express my sincere regret of having been under the necessity to make such an obtrusion, and from the receipt of your bounty am convinced that justice only was the motive for prosecuting me, and being also convinced of the necessity that absolutely exists for the punishment of offences against society, I humbly submit to my country's laws, trusting under Providence to the exertions of humanity for an amelioration of the dreadful sentence they have pronounced against me. In the meantime, sir, permit me to say that the comfort myself and children have derived from your bounty will ever impress on my mind sentiments of real gratitude by enforcing a duty of always praying for the happiness and prosperity of my donors. ElizabethWare.
Sadly, on the 21st of November 1803, time runs out for Elizabeth and her daughter Jane. Along with 130 other female convicts, they set sail for Port Jackson, Australia on the ship Experiment. The journey for women convicts transported to Australia in the 1800s was fraught with hardship. They endured overcrowded, unsanitary conditions leading to the spread of diseases like typhoid and dysentery. The long voyages, sometimes lasting over 6 months, as was the case for Elizabeth, were grueling, with limited access to fresh water, proper food and medical care. And the emotional toll of separation from their families and homeland, along with the constant threat of violence and abuse. For those women with young children in tow like Elizabeth, the challenges were even greater. Lack of proper nutrition and medical care made it difficult to protect their children, who were vulnerable to illness and neglect. High infant mortality rates caused immense grief and trauma on these trips. Elizabeth's arrival in Australia was only 5 years after the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay, and as you can imagine, she would have faced tremendous challenges undertaking hard labour while caring for a young child, Jane. It's around the same time that the first penal settlement in Van Diemen's Land is established as Risdon Cove, just upriver from the current location of Hobart. This follows the failure of a similar settlement near Sorrento in Port Phillip Bay. It is here that the sailing ship Sophia arrives in February 1805 with about 30 female convicts, including our Elizabeth, minus her daughter Jane. This makes Elizabeth one of the very first female convicts to be transported to this remote part of the world. The exact reason why Jane is not on the Sophia with her mother remains unknown. It's likely, however, that rather than exposing her young 3-year-old daughter to the dangers of a harsh, unexplored environment, Elizabeth chose to leave Jane at Port Jackson with fellow convict Sarah Tandy, whom she met on the trip to Australia on the convict ship. A wise decision considering the events that were about to unfold, and one for which my family and I are sincerely grateful, for without it we wouldn't be here today. The authorities soon realised that Risdon Cove is unsuitable for a penal settlement and relocate down the Derwent River to what is now the capital of Tasmania, Hobart. Records suggest that all the convicts at Risdon Cove, including our Elizabeth, were returned to Port Jackson before the Hobart settlement was constructed. However, in April 1809, when the convict ship Alias departs Hobart for England after having left Sydney a week or so before, they discover a stowaway on board. Her name is Elizabethware. Although it's conceivable that Elizabeth managed to board the ship in Sydney, it is more than likely that she boarded the vessel during its brief stopover in Hobart, which means that Elizabeth was either reshipped back to Van Diemen's Land at some point after being relocated from Risdon Cove, or more than likely she never actually left. Convict stowaways returning to England at this time faced a perilous and uncertain journey, often hiding in cramped, unsanitary spaces with limited access to food and water. The risk of discovery was high, and if caught, they faced severe punishment, including being thrown overboard or harsh treatment and abuse by the crew. Faced with these dangers, there's no doubt Elizabeth was desperate to return home to her children in England and to maybe settle up a score or two with her no-good husband. It took over 9 months for the Aeolus to sail to England, and on the 2nd of December 1809, it finally sailed up the Thames and set anchor in the upper part of Woolwich Reach, Kent. It is here that a police officer by the name of John Gotti, previously alerted to Elizabeth's presence, takes her into custody at about 11:30 that night. 4 days later, on the 6th of December 1809, she finds herself once more in the Old Bailey, charged with the very serious crime of returning from transportation before serving her sentence. Before Justice Gross, a Mr. William Hanson, the turnkey at Newgate Prison, is asked to identify the prisoner, which he does as Elizabethware. He goes on to state that she was tried here in the Old Bailey 6 years ago and sentenced to transportation for 14 years. In her defence, the following formal plea for mercy is submitted to the court.
Gentlemen, the case of the person under examination is probably the most singular that ever attracted your notice. In the first place, my affection for my husband induced me to take a crime on myself for which I suffered the sentence of the law. My time being nearly out, I embraced an opportunity which offered a return to England. I have 2 children in England, and my affection for them led me to accept the happy opportunity of embracing my dear offspring. I have suffered much on my passage. I submit my case to my dearly beloved sovereign for an act of royal mercy, and for which there cannot be a doubt but the Lord will command an extra blessing on his royal brow. Gentlemen, consider a mother's feelings for her children. Give me them, and no punishment that the law can inflict will be the thought too severe by the most unhappy of the human race. Oh dear gentlemen, consider the unhappy state of the unfortunate.
Despite her compelling pleas for mercy, Elizabeth is found guilty of the charge and sentenced to death. She is 28 years old. Elizabeth is returned to Newgate Prison to await her execution.
Women prisoners at Newgate Prison in the 1800s endured appalling conditions. The prison was overcrowded, unsanitary and disease-ridden, with many inmates suffering from illnesses like typhus and dysentery. Female prisoners were often crammed into small, filthy cells with little ventilation, and they slept on the floor without proper bedding. The lack of basic necessities of life, such as clean water, food and clothing, made their lives even more miserable. Violence and abuse were rampant both from fellow inmates and the guards. The women had to cook their own food and wash themselves in their small cells, adding to their daily struggles.
On Christmas Day, the 25th of December 1809, a formal petition for mercy and clemency is submitted to the Governor and Directors of the Bank of England on behalf of Elizabeth. It reads,
that your petitioner in the year 1803 received from her husband Thomas Ware, prosecuted by the bank in May 1803, sundry notes purporting to be good and lawful notes of the Bank of England, that under the influence and direction of her said husband, she had sent a few into circulation, previous to her discovery of their being counterfeits. That on such discovery your petitioner, overwhelmed with the deepest affliction, under a just sense of the enormity of the crime, remonstrated against the guilty deed, but too truly predicted the fatal consequence which immediately followed. Her husband having fled from justice, your petitioner fell an innocent victim to the offended laws of her country, and after pleading guilty to her indictment, she receives sentence of 14 years transportation to New South Wales, as appears from the records of the session, at which she was tried and which was immediately carried into execution, leaving behind her 2 unprotected female infant children, and a third, hanging at her breast, has shared the sufferings of its unhappy mother. Considering her sentence to be for 7 years only, she embraced the only opportunity that might ever probably happen to enfold in her longing arms her long-lost children, but having been delivered into the hands of justice, the awful letter of the law has been pronounced against her life. Your petitioner, filled with the sorrow and contrition for the crime, and oppressed with the weight of her sufferings, implores your forgiveness, and under a grateful sense of former favours subsequent to her first trial and conviction, with the deepest humility prays, gentlemen, that you will be pleased to take the circumstances attending her very singular case into your serious consideration, and, in your superior wisdom, be pleased to address the sacred person of His Majesty, the Fountain of Mercy, once more to restore to society and the embraces of her dear, friendless children, a poor creature who has been nearly 7 years drinking the bitterest dregs from the vials of human misery, for a crime for which she became innocently involved. Your humble petitioner begs leave to assure the gentlemen of the Bank of England that should His Majesty be graciously pleased to grant the prayer of a petition signed by near 50 of His Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects and respectable householders, that the death of her late husband gives her an opportunity of embracing an offer of marriage much to her advantage with a person of the purest morals and very respectable connections, who only awaits for the pardon of your suffering petitioner to make her happy in the management of an extensive eating house. Under the above circumstances, your most humble petitioner prays you will be pleased to grant the prayer of her petition, the most grateful sense of which will be ever retained, and your petitioner, with her children, and probably children's children, will in all duty bound ever pray for their benefactors. Elizabeth Ware.
A copy of a note from the bank solicitor is attached to this correspondence, which is currently located in the archives of the Bank of England. It reads, Mrs. Ware's petition has been submitted to the Governor and Directors of the bank who cannot interfere on her behalf, dated the 4th of January 1810. It is interesting to note that in her petition, Elizabeth makes mention that her husband John Ware, her letter take the blame for the counterfeit banknotes, has died, and quite remarkably she has received an offer of marriage while she was still in jail from an owner of an extensive eating house. Despite the failure of the Bank of England to intervene, shortly thereafter Elizabeth is granted mercy from His Majesty George III on condition that she is transported back to the coast of New South Wales for a term of 14 years to commence and be computed from the date of her first trial in July 1803. This prompts a series of further letters to the board and directors of the Bank of England seeking some modest financial assistance to help alleviate her dire circumstances in the lead up to her transportation back to Australia. The first letter, dated the 25th of March 1810, which is barely legible, suggesting it was written by Elizabeth without any help, contains a plea for a trifle weekly wage to alleviate her terrible situation. It reads,
Most honoured gentlemen, I most humbly bow down to you and beg your human hearts will pardon the liberty I take in thus addressing you as desired by Mr. Suitor, to apply to you, as he has stated, all accounts with you, and that by your desire you would pay me a trifle weekly wage. I have had nothing, about a fortnight is now relapse, and I have received nothing from anyone, and being very friendless, have taken the liberty of begging a trifle to support me whilst confined in this melancholy dwelling, and for every extreme kindness I have received, and beg leave to return my most grateful thanks, and most humbly bow down to you, kind gentlemen, praying for a continuance of your kind benevolence, and will ever, as in duty bound, constantly pray and beg leave to subscribe myself, right honoured sirs, your obedient and humble servant, Elizabeth Ware.
As Elizabeth's circumstances become more desperate, she writes another barely decipherable letter to the Governor of the Bank of England. It reads,
Honoured Sir, I humbly hope your goodness will pardon the liberty I take of writing, as a month has now passed since I had any relief. I hope you have not withdrawn your kindness. I would not take the liberty of writing, but being unwilling to part with those necessities which I have, I further beg leave to return my most grateful thanks for those favours I have already received, and shall ever think myself in duty bound, and in the meantime beg leave to subscribe myself your most obedient and very humble servant, Elizabeth Ware.
Once again, Elizabeth's plea for assistance proves successful, for on the 23rd of October 1810, they receive another letter thanking them for their generosity and requesting further assistance. In this letter, which this time appears to be written with some help, Elizabeth once again outlines her desperate situation and her imminent transportation to New South Wales.
Gentlemen, I cannot sufficiently express my gratitude to you, not only for a former but the present allowance of 7 shillings per week you are so kindly pleased to make to me, and which I have found such essential service to myself and children, that I should think myself blamable indeed were I not most gratefully to acknowledge such generosity in the best manner I am able. From the distressed state myself and children were in, previously to your granting me the above allowance, I was of necessity, even for the common necessaries of life, obliged to pawn or part with nearly the whole of my wearing apparel, which of myself I shall never be able to redeem. I therefore have presumed, but reluctantly, to state to you that in consequence of having received orders to hold myself in readiness to be sent off to New South Wales by the next ship, which is expected very shortly to sail, and having experienced your liberality on a former but lamentable occasion, emboldens me to ask permission to be allowed, and for the last time, let my future fate be whatever it may, to again solicit that you will, with your usual humanity, be pleased to afford me such pecuniary assistance as you have usually extended to such unfortunates as myself on similar occasions. I humbly beg leave to subscribe myself with the most grateful heart, your most obedient and very humble servant, Elizabeth Ware.
As Elizabeth's situation grows increasingly dire, she once again appeals to the Bank of England seeking assistance to reclaim her pawned clothing. She fears they will be lost if she is shipped off without them.
Honoured gentlemen, I humbly beg permission to state to you that I am given to understand that it is but a few days before I shall take my departure from this dreary dwelling, and most humbly beg pardon for thus I'm being in extreme distress for what few articles which my long confinement I have been obliged to pawn. Most humbly pray, as Mr. Suitor told me that you had humanely offered to remit a trifle to redeem them. I hope and trust that your feeling hearts will please to bestow, that I do not offend in asking for it before leaving prison, as it will be impossible to get them when on board without being defrauded, and I will be ever careful to lay it to the best advantage, and for such goodness will, as in duty bound, for ever pray and beg, I have subscribed myself, right honoured gentlemen, your most obedient, very humble servant, Elizabeth Ware.
The next we hear of Elizabeth is in another letter located in the archives of the Bank of England, dated the 9th of February 1811. Unlike the other letters, this one is written on behalf of Elizabeth and fellow convict Amelia Bellairs, who was also being transported to New South Wales on a charge of being in possession of forged banknotes. In this letter, Elizabeth and Amelia shed light on their deteriorating situation in Newgate Prison and outlined their disappointment in not receiving financial assistance they were promised at a meeting the day before. It reads,
Honoured gentlemen, we unfortunate sufferers, Elizabeth Ware and Amelia Bellairs, humbly bow down to you, craving pardon in the liberty we now take in troubling you, but when we had the happiness of seeing you yesterday, we understood that Mr. Suitor was to give us the money your goodness was pleased to bestow. We cordially waited upon Mr. Suitor this morning, in hopes from your humanity that he might have let us have the money to redeem our clothes, which makes us both very unhappy, as Mr. Suitor seems to doubt whether you would not be displeased. I hope your goodness will not think we take too great liberty in begging you. We will be pleased to send Mr. Suitor immediately, that we may redeem our little necessities, as without them our cases will be terribly distressing. To be put on a shore in a foreign country naked, and stress, kind gentlemen, our time is very short, as Tuesday next is the day we expect to be put on board, and I hope and trust to have your answer by the bearer, which will much alleviate the sorrows of the truly unhappy Elizabeth Ware and Amelia Bellairs. On the reverse side of the letter was written, We have just been called to Mr. Suitor, and by his desire he was to write to you immediately, as there is not a moment to lose. At the same time we showed Mr. Suitor our duplicates. Prisoner duplicates were essentially copies of pawned tickets or receipts given to convicts when they pawned items such as their personal effects or clothing.
When the convict ship Friends finally set sail from Galleon's Reach on the River Thames on the 9th of March 1811, it sailed without its full planned contingent of 100 women convicts. Instead, 86 women were initially boarded in the Thames before 3 women were removed, some over health concerns. One of the female convicts who failed to sail that day was Elizabeth Ware. The exact reasons why she wasn't on that ship today remain a mystery. One version outlined in the book The Girl Who Stole Stockings, which tells the story of a young female convict that was on that ship that day, Susanna Noon, is that Elizabeth Ware was pardoned from transportation on the 29th of May 1811, provided security was given for her good behaviour for the remainder of her sentence. Another possibility is, as mentioned in her Christmas Day petition to the King, she eventually marries her well-connected, very respectable suitor who owns an extensive eating house and lives happily thereafter. At this point, we can't be clear exactly what happened to Elizabeth, but investigations are ongoing. So what about her daughter Jane, whom she left in care of fellow convict Sarah Tandy at Port Jackson before she was shipped off to Van Diemen's Land? Well, as it turns out, Sarah continued to raise Jane as her own daughter, even after she marries a John Wire some years later. Jane eventually adopts her stepfather's surname Wire to become Jane Wire before she marries my great-great-great-great-grandfather John Barber in 1821. He is an ex-convict. If you want to learn more about how Jane and John's son Samuel and his wife Elizabeth eventually moved to the Western District of Victoria, be sure to check out Day 5 in my road trip video series. This ends our exploration into the life and times of my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother Elizabeth Ware, née Cooper Wilson, my earliest known Australian ancestor, albeit for a period of just 6 years. I'm sure you agree that Elizabeth's story, though marked by hardship, ultimately speaks to the enduring power of hope and the unwavering determination of the human spirit. Despite facing abandonment, imprisonment and transportation, Elizabeth fought tirelessly to reunite with her children. While the details of her later life remain shrouded in mystery, her legacy lives on through her daughter Jane and her descendants, which includes me and my family. It's also a powerful reminder of the enduring strength of family bonds and the courage it takes to overcome adversity. Thanks for watching, and please make sure you share this story with your family and friends. Until next time, see ya.